Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. And one housekeeping note for today's episode. It's an event that's pretty far out, but also maybe the good news, fingers crossed, is that things will be opened up and safer to have an event this far out. This Halloween 2020, the week of, specifically October 28th, we're going to do a live Monster Professor event. The great folks down at Florida Southwestern State College, that's down in Fort Myers, Florida, have invited me down to do an event. We're going to talk my books. We're going to talk storytelling, horror structure, the new world of publication, but we're definitely going to talk monsters. In fact, there's a special request for Godzilla as a subject matter, so you're not getting any Godzilla info until that event. It's going to be a theater setting, open to the public, so check it out if you are able to anywhere nearby, but we're also recording the whole event and going to release that as an episode, so even if you can't be there in person, you're going to get to hear it on the Monster Professor. That's going to be a ton of fun. With that said, let's get into today's episode. What about monsters and the martial arts? Have you wondered about that? And if you haven't before, I'm going to make you wonder now. Because what if you have to find yourself fighting, say, a zombie unarmed? Or what are you going to do against a vampire or a werewolf? We've talked about some, perhaps, weaponry in past episodes, like how do you kill it, but we haven't really thought about your specific techniques and strategies martial arts style. But what about the real life human monsters that make martial arts necessary? Or what would a martial arts expert say is your best bet? Well, we get to talk with a martial arts expert, and here we go. It's my huge honor and pleasure to get to speak with Jeff Westfall right now. He'll hate me for calling him a martial arts master. That's a term he would never self-apply. So maybe I'll say he's a living, breathing martial arts cyborg. I've seen journalists call him a modern-day poet warrior or scholar samurai. I think that fits pretty well. He's also a teacher. Now he's a podcaster and a YouTuber. He's got the Martial Brain podcast, and he started some YouTube instructionals recently. I'll have links to those in the description, and we'll get more info on how to find those a little later on. I think it's worth noting to everybody listening that I have a personal connection with Mr. Jeff Westfall. He's kind of like the Doc Brown to my Marty McFly, or maybe maybe the Hannibal Lecter to my Agent Starling.
I think that's probably more appropriate.
Because he's been one of the most important mentors in my life, and he also beat the hell out of me more times than I can count. I think. And I think if a really like a brief picture for everyone, if you take the original Spock from the original Star Trek series, but instead of Leonard Nimoy, if you had cast Bruce Lee as Mr. Spock, you got Jeff Westfall. I think that's what we have here.
Oh my gosh.
So he's owner and chief instructor at the Rising Phoenix Martial Arts Academy since 1980, I think it is. In Evansville, Indiana, where he's been teaching martial arts since 76, training since at least 71. So that's even before Bruce Lee entered the Dragon and Enter the Dragon. There at the Rising Phoenix Martial Arts Academy, they teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, or also known as Thai boxing, CSW, combat submission wrestling, essentially kind of Shuto Vale-Tudo, Filipino martial arts, Junfan Kung Fu, and concepts from Jeet Kune Do, Majapahit martial arts, Western fencing. Jeff Westfall is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Marcelo Monteiro, which few people can say they are black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. black belt in judo. In Muay Thai, he's an Ajarn, essentially a senior instructor under Ajarn Chai. Ajarn Chai's full title and name I will totally mispronounce, and so I won't even try. Under Guru Dan Inasanto, and the Inasanto International Martial Arts Instructors Association, he holds 3 ranks: full instructor in Junfan Kung Fu, full instructor in Filipino martial arts, instructor in the Majapahit martial arts. Under Eric Paulson and CSW, he's an authorized representative and coach. He also trains in boxing or standard or Western boxing, fencing, Kyokushin karate, Tai Lung Kung Fu, Silat, a range of deadly weapons, also deadly rational logic and argumentation, I would add, among other disciplines. And he's serious no matter how many years go by in taking his physical fitness and conditioning seriously. So, with all that, Jeff Westfall, welcome to the
now?
Monster Professor.
You want a cigarette?
I am. I feel like we got through one of the warm-ups that felt like a full workout. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, I appreciate you asking me to be on. This kind of reminds me of one of the reasons I started my podcast is when I'm in a group of martial artists, I always feel like I'm the biggest nerd in the room. And when I'm with a group of skeptics and rationalists, I always feel like I'm the biggest jock in the room. So, you are a kindred spirit in that regard. So it was very kind of you to ask me to be on your show.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think your podcast, The Martial Brain, mixes the world of the nerd and the world of the dangerous martial artist or jock quite well. I haven't really done that kind of thing on this podcast, and there have only been like very brief hints at my experience or interest in the martial arts, but man, I think, did I first show up? I first darkened your doorstep in the late 90s, I think, or something like that.
Some snot-nosed kid from Henderson, Kentucky walked in my place and said, I want to do martial arts. No. And have you told them your fight name?
I have not. No. Let's go ahead and start with him.
Josh is Super Freak. And that has to be accompanied by the Rick James music in the background. He's a very kinky girl, the kind you don't take home to mama.
Yeah, we, everybody kind of earned, through blood, sweat, and tears, their own names, no matter what name they wished for themselves. You just got stuck with yours. And
yeah, well, that's the rule of nicknames anyway. You don't get to pick your nickname.
Right.
I talked about that in one of my podcasts. I had a martial arts associate back in the day who was really not really very well liked by a lot of the other guys around. So, he didn't really get a nickname like the other guys did. So he selected his own, and it was pretty grandiose, and it didn't work out well.
Now, here's another insight to your nerdiness. If I'm remembering correctly, you're the Raging Squirrel, and people started calling you back in your early days of sparring and fighting the Rabid Squirrel, but you rejected it because biologically squirrels cannot contract rabies. So you adjusted it?
That's actually that. I think you must have.
Am I misremembering that?
Happened was, I used to go to back in the 70s. The only way you could compete in my area was in point karate, which is it's kind of getting a resurgence of getting a little more love than it used to get. But I got disgusted with it and quit it. But in the 70s, it was all you could do, and I used to see the guys that I would compete against with these really, really grandiose titles. Or nicknames stenciled on their uniforms, like the Butcher, the Exterminator, the Cobra. I was like, Bob, you're a plumber. It's why I kick most of you guys' asses, and I don't have a silly nickname like that. So anyway, this was right when the movie The Raging Bull was out, and I'm ranting about this subject to my training partner, and I'm looking in the mirror, and I had these gloves on that had individual fingers, the old Bruce Lee fighting gloves, and when I opened my hand out, they looked just like rodent claws. And I said, I'm the Raging Squirrel. So I actually gave that to myself.
It seemed to fit, though, for some reason. That's a self-applied one that seemed to fit. I'm not
yeah,
quite
it stuck, too.
And a super freak, if I'm remembering correctly, that came about. I think I used some lankiness and natural young guy flexibility as part of my strategy to keep me from getting my ass kicked as much as it would have otherwise. I
Right.
think.
You were one of the students there that was almost as flexible in the shoulders as I was, and so it was damnably hard to catch you in a submission hold.
Yeah, well, I still remember many hours of pain and misery and getting beat on. But I was addicted to the chess game of it all. And,
Absolutely.
yeah, and your place was a Rising Phoenix, and your instructorship was it was a great place for a mind like that to flourish, in which we got to see the real depth and strategy in the fight game, no
Well,
matter
thank
how
you.
realistic it gets. Um, I've got, and so listeners might be wondering, well, what the hell does all this martial arts stuff have to do with monsters? Well,
Yes. Yes.
well, I'm gonna get to some literal monster stuff because eventually I want to find out from a martial arts expert how one might defend oneself against real monsters were they to be true, among other concepts. But I thought maybe we would start with this idea of real life monsters because I've had a lot of requests from listeners who are interested in, yeah, but what about, forget the mythological or the fictional, what about the monsters in real life? What about the really dangerous people and the killers that a lot of folks are honestly afraid of? And that in that world, that you kind of came to mind as somebody who understands what makes the martial arts necessary more than just a hobby or more than just a path of self-improvement or discipline. There's a real world imperative on that. And if I'm remembering correctly, you've even had experience with these kinds of real life monsters or have helped people learn to defend themselves against them. So I'm curious if we could get your take on the kind of real life monsters from your experience and knowledge that make martial arts necessary. What's your take on that?
Well, it's one thing I say to my students quite a bit is, well, first of all, I talk about spectrums, if you will, a lot. When you're talking humans, any of the humanities, it's really hard to be bipolar and say, well, it's either this or that. You know, people all tend to fall on a spectrum in so many different ways. And I talk about that a lot on my podcast. And one of those is, you know, where on the spectrum are you of dangerousness as a human animal compared to others? I'll have people occasionally say or ask, how long before I can defend myself? And I will sort of tongue in cheek say, well, you already can defend yourself against newborn babies. Um, and so you already, so it's not a question of whether or not you can defend yourself. It's where do you fall on the spectrum? And tying back with skepticism, one of the things that really is emphasized in skepticism is neuropsychological humility, which is that no matter how much you study, no matter how much you know, the amount of things in the universe that you don't know vastly, you know, outnumber the amount of things that you do know. And so you want to be humble in the face of your ignorance. And I think the same thing is true when you're talking about the presence of really dangerous humans out there. The best trained martial artists in the world are very dangerous human beings. But there are still some folks out there that their humility and common sense makes them steer clear of if it's possible.
Yeah.
I'll give you a couple examples. Back, this was back around the time when you were training, I think. It was a Friday evening at my academy, and I don't know if you remember, there used to be a festival just around the corner every year at the Germania Minor Corps, which is a German American lodge that's around the corner from where my school used to be.
Yeah.
And they had this annual Folks Fest. Well, this fellow comes staggering from the Folks Fest. I think he'd been thrown out by security. He was shirtless. And a couple of my students come in, first of all, and they say, hey, something's going on out in the street. And so I go out and I look, and what I see is I see this fellow, and he was about 6'2", had a little bit of a belly on him, but was definitely a big, strong-looking guy, Native American looking, and he was staggering right through my parking lot, not towards me, but just kind of laterally going through my parking lot, and right along behind him, like a clown car of security guards and off-duty cops, were all this line of guys, and they were all whipping out collapsible batons and different weapons and trying to tell him to stop, and he's just staggering along and waving his hand back like the heck with you. He goes across the street, and if you'll recall, there was an abandoned gas station across the street from my academy, and he kind of fetches up in this empty yard next to that. And before long, there are 4 cop cars pull up. There's like a dozen cops with their weapons drawn surrounding this guy. And he fetches up against a chain link fence like a bear that's being surrounded by a bunch of blue tick hounds. And he's just kind of looking at him through his shaggy brows. And they're sort of yelling at him to get on the ground. And he won't do it. One of the cops gets a shotgun out of his trunk and shoots him. And then I later realized it was with one of the bean bags that they use for crowd control. Yeah. He didn't flinch. I mean, it was just like a bee sting on him. They did it twice more. They shot him 3 times with these shotgun bean bags, and he shrugged that stuff off. So at another point, like I said, he's up against a chain link fence. One of the cops goes about 30 feet down away from him, jumps over the fence, comes up behind him, rears up on his toes, and comes overhead with a smash with his collapsible steel baton, hits him right on the crown of the head. And the guy just kind of shrugs and turns around and looks back. The bead, I don't know if you ever looked at a collapsible baton, but there's a steel bead on the end, like a round sphere, about a half inch. That thing broke off and flew through the air when he hit him with it. It broke his collapsible baton. And the cop freaked out and backed up and ran back down and jumped back over the fence. Another one jumped over the fence and tried to run up behind him and choke him. And he did not apply the rear naked choke very well. Had he choked him, I mean, that would have taken care of it. But this guy starts flopping around, and it takes practice, not just, going to the police academy once a year for a weekend training session to do a chokehold correctly. Plus, they're not really technically supposed to do chokeholds, so he was probably trying to do this really lame technique that police are allowed to use called a lateral vascular restraint, which is like a watered-down choke that doesn't really do much of anything. And so that didn't work. And eventually what they had, at one point, he reaches in his pocket, and I thought, they're going to kill him now. And he threw out what later turned out to be a folding knife. And I guess his thinking was, I want to get this out of my pocket so they don't find a weapon on me. They almost shot him, but his back was right up, 8 feet away from a house. So they couldn't shoot him. So eventually they had to sort of time it and just mob him. All of them ran towards him at once, like all 10 cops, and did just a rugby scrum on him. And that's what finally got him. Then he starts complaining, why you got to do me like this? Okay, now that's one story about guys like that. One more. I used to have a training partner named Dale Tain, really tough guy, good friend of mine. We really learned a lot beating on and being beaten on by each other. And he told me about, he was a civilian jailer. And he told me about a guy that was in solitary confinement that he called the Gray Mare, which was this guy's CB handle. And he says, you got to meet this guy. You got to meet this guy. So he took me up into the jail, and he snuck me back into the solitary confinement area where I was not allowed to go. And he goes up to this cell, and there's this African-American gentleman. He looked like he was also about 6'2", looked like he could have played linebacker for the Cincinnati Bengals. I mean, just ripped, wearing a pair of skivvies and a pair of flip-flops because they weren't allowed to have hard shoes. And he had smeared soap all over himself, so he looked like he had paint on himself or something. But and Dale goes up and he called my friend Dale Bone Shaker. He goes, "Hey, Bone Shaker, how you doing?" And Dale goes, "I want to introduce you to someone." And I shook this guy's hand. His hand just enveloped mine. My hand was, just disappeared inside his hand. He was a real nice guy. And I talked to Dale about him later on. He goes, "Yeah, as long as he's on his meds, he's fine. But sometimes he cheeks his meds, which means he hides it in his cheek. And then when he goes off, he's really, really dangerous. He's here. We house him. He's a murderer from Ohio, and we make money from Ohio, from the state, to house him here. But he's a very dangerous murderer. But he says, but he likes me, so we talk all the time. But he said that one time when he went off, that they did an insertion into his cell, and when they went in after him, now Dale, a rear naked choke, but I'll get to that. When they ran in, and the first officer hit him with a stun gun. Now this is in days before tasers. So what a stun gun was like a primitive form of taser that you touched someone and pushed a trigger or a button. And I had some ridiculous tens of thousands of volts in it, and usually was enough to subdue someone. Well, the gray mare just turned and looked at him and said, "If you do that again, I'll kill you." and this fellow Marlin quickly backpedaled out of the cell. Dale got in there and managed to get behind the gray mare and start putting on a rear naked choke. And then the guy who's now the sheriff in Vanderburgh County, but was then just a deputy, he had been a power lifter, and he was a really, really good squatter. He charges in and nails the gray mare up against the cell wall, or against the cell bars, unfortunately sandwiching my friend Dale in the process and knocking him loose from his rear naked choke. They eventually got this guy down, but that's another example of someone who is just, you don't want to mess with this guy. Even if you have the capability, it's just not worth the trouble. So absolutely, I've heard of lots of examples of this. I mean, you can look in sport. Remember Alexander Karelin?
Oh yeah, monster.
I mean, there's a human monster if ever there was one. 6'6", 280 pounds, body fat of about 4%, and a world class wrestler. What are you going to do with a guy like that?
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah. So, those stories, I've seen monsters handled in movies more easily than people have handled those two guys. If you have a silver bullet.
Choreographed, yeah.
Yeah. And so you got monsters like that running around who actually have monstrous minds. Now, maybe some of them are because of psychological problems that can be medicated, but regardless, I mean, they have monstrous, dark, murderous minds in gigantic, scary, pseudo-immune bodies. So what's the point of even training martial arts, would you say to somebody who's thinking about that kind of stuff?
That's a good question. I mean, those guys, I'm because you asked me about monsters, I went to the far end of the spectrum for examples. But the good news is those are rare outliers. I mean, you don't meet guys like that all the time. Now, there are definitely plenty of dangerous folks walking around out there, but you can't worry about what you can't handle. You can only worry about, again, let's look back at the spectrum of dangerousness of a human. Wherever you fall on the spectrum, there's a group on the negative end where they're just not really going to be a problem for you in a self-defense situation. I mean, it will be laughable. Then there's a group on the far right that you're going to be laughable for them. Then in the middle is where your training comes to bear. If you have no training and no athletic ability, that slides you way towards the left end of the spectrum. And the more you train, the more you work your way towards the other end. It's foolish to assume you can ever make it all the way to the end of the spectrum unless you are just incredibly gifted. But that should never deter one from continuing to train, because it's incredibly useful to be effective at martial arts, especially at effective martial arts. Because there are plenty of situations where someone foolishly wants to try to impose their will on you physically, and there just really is no excuse for that, because you should be able to defend yourself against them. There are plenty of folks like that. But we're playing the odds. We're playing the numbers here. There are plenty of people that martial arts training would do you a ton of good against, that if you had no training would really be a problem for you.
Yeah, and what was so?
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's a great answer to that. It's
like, let me use one more example. It's like a doctor. Why become a doctor if you're going to have patients die on you?
Yeah.
Right. Of course, there's an old cliche in the medical, there's an old dark cliche in the medical world, and that is, you're not a real doctor until you've killed a patient. But still on net, I will stack most MDs up with lots of other people insofar as the good work that they do in their life. But yet at the same time, there's going to be some negative. So, oh my gosh, and we have a tendency as humans to make the perfect the enemy of the good. If I can't beat up the monster, why train in the martial arts? If a doctor can't save everyone, why go to a doctor? Magic is much more infallible. Let's have some shaman shake beads and mutter prayers over my daughter who needs a kidney transplant instead. Did I go off on a weird tangent there?
No, I still think it's a good, and actually you're setting us up for where I want to get a little bit later, which is to get into your skepticism and your approach to rational thinking, because on this show I think I've only had the opposite. and
on a show about monsters, get out of here. Are you kidding?
And so, yeah, we need to balance that out a little bit. But maybe just staying in kind of the dirt under the fingernails pragmatics of martial arts for a little bit. Like if somebody were wanting to know from somebody who has trained a lot with weapons, without, and trained at a whole bunch of different arts all over the place with some of the most renowned and impressive fighters, champions, and martial artists alive. If you probably hate a question like this, but listeners want to know. And I have an opinion, I have opinions on it too, but mine don't weigh as much as yours. If somebody said, give me one martial art or one discipline to train in that is going to be my best odds at real world self-defense, which martial art should I do?
Well, I'll get to my answer to that. But first, let me stipulate that all a martial art really is, in the final analysis, is a program that a coach has put together. And in a way, you can say that every coach's approach is a different martial art. So if I were to pick an art, I would almost need to break it down to how which coach teaches it. But I won't get that granular. And it's also like, asking me that question, and you did stipulate right up front that it can be a silly question to ask, but I do get asked this a lot. Another way of sort of looking at that question is, okay, I'm going to go on the road and I don't want my car to break down. What's the best tool to take along with me?
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
By definition, You're going to be leaving some tools out. You can only take one. So I hate to choose one. If I did have to choose one, I would choose any of the submission grappling disciplines. And there's the reason for that is very simple. Gravity works in one direction. When two people hook up in a fight, very quickly, in 95% of cases, if not much higher, very quickly, one of them will not be having fun anymore. It's very rare that it stays evenly matched for a long time. If it does, it goes along until something sways it. But eventually, all fights reach a point where either someone breaks it up or one person's not having fun anymore. What does that person do when they're not having fun anymore? They run away, they lay down and surrender, they negotiate, whatever it is that they do. But one of the most common things that they do is charge the other person. So when someone says, well, I don't need grappling training, I don't want to learn how to grapple because I'm going to keep everyone away from me. Well, good luck. That's look at two eagles. When eagles fight, they fly up in the sky and they go at each other with their talons, and they lock talons, and they immediately start plummeting as a four-wing unit towards the ground. And that's, to me, a grand analogy of the way a lot of fights are, is two guys that don't necessarily want to get on the ground. Maybe they even think it's a little sissified to get on the ground. Doesn't matter. Before too long, one of them's grabbing the other one around the head, and they sort of collapse to the ground under their own weight because they don't know what to do once they've locked up with each other like that. So gravity doesn't go up, it goes down. So when anything, I call it the slippery slope principle of fighting. As soon as things don't go the way you want, it will tend to descend towards grappling. Now, whether you know enough to survive in that world is irrelevant to whether or not it's going to go there. It simply is. I don't think that grappling is, quote, whatever this means, unquote, better than the other martial arts. I simply think that the need for grappling skills shows up sooner in a fight very often. And there's always someone who goes, well, yeah, but can't I use striking to keep the guy away? Sometimes, yes. But when you don't, you're in trouble. And there's lots of people that want to stay away from grappling for whatever reason. They don't like the thought of rubbing around on another sweaty person, or it just looks too complicated for them, or it looks painful, or for whatever reason, there are a lot of martial arts people that don't want to hear that grappling is useful. And I stipulate that it's not only useful, it's pivotal for that reason. Now, again, I've got to emphasize, this doesn't mean that I think grappling is better than Muay Thai or any of my other children, any of the other arts that I teach. I simply think that if I had to pick one, that's the one I would pick, because most folks are clueless on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and that kind of maps on to my thinking on it through the years. Like I loved Muay Thai, and I've grown more and more in love with boxing, but but what that seems to specialize in is damaging somebody else, but without as much control over their body or their position. And I love wrestling too, like actually, like what we see, say, in Olympics or college or high school and stuff. And that's a blast. And that seems to specialize in control, and the damage is almost illegal, depending on how you define that damage. But something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kind of marries control and damage together. You can do both. And that seems to match on quite well.
That's very well put. Yeah, I agree 100%. And now let's add into the equation the effect of training. And what I mean by that is, next year I will have been in the martial arts for 50 years. And
congratulations on that, man. That's awesome.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it? Anyway, it's taken its toll on my body, and it surely has taken a toll on my brain cells. I mean, that's unavoidable when you think about it. I mean, we now know things about brain damage, about traumatic brain injury that were unknown 10 years ago. We now know that if you get a concussion while you're still recovering from a concussion, you just got roughly an order of magnitude greater amount of damage. You got 10 concussions in one dose. And I can't count how many times through the years where I was sparring hard with buddies, and I'd get my bell rung, and I'd get up, I'd sit down and kind of wait till my head felt like it cleared a little bit, and I'd go spar some more. That was moronic. I just didn't know that it was moronic at the time. And your brain cannot be toughened. So I have tons of respect for the striking arts, and I will continue to teach them, but I have modified the way I teach them, because it's just not practical to use hard contact to the head, no matter how much I learned the hard way from doing that so much through the years, tens of thousands of hours of sparring. I'm lucky to be able to spell my name, tie my shoes, and not dribble all the time. And so, especially when I teach children, I no longer teach kicking and punching to children. Another thing that we now know is that when a child gets a concussion, they get an extra order of magnitude. They get 10 concussions all at once compared to an adult when they get a concussion. And the only way to teach someone to effectively kickbox is to have them spar. And I'm just not comfortable having children spar. So anyway, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but I agree that you can train harder in the grappling arts with less injury and damage than you can in the striking arts. Now, that's not to say that you don't get hurt doing grappling, especially the way some people go about it. But if you're sensible, if you have someone who's running the academy who sets up the proper culture, injuries are greatly reduced. So anyway, I agree with you that control is huge. I mean, that's really, unless you're a sociopath, or unless you let the chimpanzee get his hands on the controls, which is what I refer to when you let the primitive parts of your brain take over. It's not really your place to punish a person who you're defending yourself against. All you really need to do is control the situation. So I agree with that, with your assessment of the grappling arts in that regard.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll take some of this pragmatic knowledge and real world knowledge and take a tongue-in-cheek travel down some monsters. I want to throw some monsters at you, some maybe typical or popular monsters. And from a martial arts expert's point of view, what would you advise, or what would be your go-to move? Let's say, or not move, but strategy or setup. Let's say you were confronted in a dark alley with a zombie. And let's go with a typical zombie that wants to eat your brains, that the bite is infectious, that it feels no real pain because it's a dead body. What would you advise us to do fighting a zombie, say, if we were barehanded, let's say? What would you say?
Well, if I'm confronted with one and I see it in front of me, I'm assuming it's a slow zombie.
Yeah, let's go slow zombie.
Okay, in that case, definitely. I'm always a little hesitant about getting up around their head if the bite is the big problem. So I'm going to try to blow his knee out. Doesn't matter whether he feels it or not. If I can sidekick him in the knee, which is a very easy thing to do if you've trained, and bend his knee completely backwards, I can walk away from him.
Yeah, we're actually seeing that more and more in the UFC in the past few years, actually. They had avoided it for the longest time, that kind of Bruce Lee low sideline kick to snap somebody's knee backward. And there's
they've kind of got a gray area in the rules there with that, don't they? I think, isn't it John Jones?
Yeah, really started doing it.
Has been using that. Yeah, I heard about that. It's funny. I did a podcast about the low sidekick. I called it the red-headed stepchild of striking. Because back in the 70s, I taught my students to sidekick to the knee, and we were very careful when we sparred, but we didn't do it when we sparred. And my school had a reputation for being crazy. Those guys kick to the knee. They're insane. They're going to hurt somebody. Meanwhile, these other schools are kicking at each other's heads. That always struck me as an odd claim to make. But anyway, it's a very effective self-defense technique. And one of the things I've always emphasized with people is, if you're fighting someone who's drugged up or drunk and doesn't feel pain, it doesn't matter if they can't walk. If they can't walk, they can only crawl, and you should be able to get away from them. So that's where I would go with that one.
I like that one. I didn't see that one coming. That makes total sense, though. All right, let's amp it up a level of difficulty. How about, I'm not sure which one's tougher. Let's do vampire next. Let's do a classic vampire.
Oh
what
God.
Would you advise?
Well,
he's
depends.
wanting to suck your blood.
Yeah, that sucks. I don't have any weapons on me, eh? Goodness.
Well, maybe what would you look for? I mean, you have weapons training. I guess there's no reason to discount that.
I would look for a stick and see if I could break it and get a nice sharp edge and try to stab him through the heart. But I would not just run right up to him and do that either. It's first of all, vampires, that's a huge ramp up because, of course, every culture has got their own form of vampire and there's different ones. I mean, the way I've envisioned a vampire is he's at least as strong as Spider-Man. We're talking, strength of 10 humans. He can turn into mist. He can become invisible. He can turn into a bat. He can hypnotize me. Man, wow. That's a difficult one. Chances are he's faster and stronger than me and well nigh invulnerable to much besides being stabbed through the heart with a stake.
Do you think we could get through someone's rib cage with a sharpened piece of wood with a stake? I've always doubted that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, so to speak. I mean, they're almost designed culturally to be almost unbeatable. I would really want to have something like a blade at least. Try to cut the head off or cut a limb off if I could. I've thought a lot about the whole zombie quandary, and especially, a whole mass of slow zombies. But I haven't thought a lot about vampires, to be honest with you. That's tough.
I remember with the knife fighting, I was interested in trying out a little collie and because the knife fighting interested me at one point, and I went to you about it because I think I'd been training submission grappling and jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai there for a while, and you said something to the effect of, well, first over the weekend, here's your homework: go home with your brother or your friend, put on some white t-shirts, get some little magic markers, one in each hand, and then just try to have a knife fight, and after about 10 seconds look down to see what the cuts would have been. And in about 10 seconds, we stopped and we found out that we both would have died. Not
Oh
very
yeah.
quickly.
There's an old expression in Filipino knife fighting: winners drip, losers gush. Everybody gets cut. And that's it. It's definitely an art form. It's a gruesome art form, to be sure, but it's definitely an art form. The ability to move in such a way that you protect your vital organs while making yourself dangerous to the other person. I'm glad that I've never had to use any knife fighting skills, and I don't pursue knife fighting skills with the thought of teaching my students to carry knives or teaching my students to think about carrying knives even, but because if you're ever going to defend yourself against a knife, you need to understand how a knife works, how a knife fighter thinks, what they're doing. Now, there is, of course, the subset of students who are going to be special operators for the military. Those guys I definitely, I want them to think about how they would use a knife in combat. In that sense, it makes all the sense in the world. And I've worked with guys like that, and they don't have to be just military. They can be government agents as well. And those are folks that they need skills like that. I know a fellow who his knife fighting skills saved his life. He was in Kabul in Afghanistan, and a van pulled up behind him. He was on the sidewalk and he was facing away from the street. And he might have been talking to someone, and a van just screeched up behind him, and a door opened up, and a guy grabbed him and tried to pull him inside. Well, he was able to reach down on his belt and disengage a folding karambit, which is a particularly wicked type of blade that he had on his belt, and reach down and slice through the guy's femoral artery on the inside of his thigh. Unless that guy got to a hospital really fast, he was dead. But he dropped my friend, and they drove off. That saved his life. But who knows? That's an extreme case. I mean, that's not going to be the outcome in more mundane settings. But a knife it's such a huge force multiplier. It takes so little effort to do so much damage. It's really weird. I mean, like for example, if I were faced with a 12-year-old boy that was holding a knife, I would give that knife respect, but it wouldn't get me too nervous. But you take some of those guys I described earlier, and you put a knife in their hand, and you just made a very dangerous man much more dangerous. So yeah, that's scary stuff right there. But of course, the vampire's got the extra thing that it's got to be a wooden stake, which, like you said, makes it much harder to get through. Most cultures, if you cut the vampire's head off, and I think you stuff its mouth full of garlic and bury it or something like that. I don't know if I have time for all that in the middle of a fight.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the novel Dracula, or in the book Dracula, they ended up killing him with a Bowie knife through the heart, and
that worked, huh? It didn't have to be wooden.
Yeah, and the kukri knife to behead him, and so that ended him.
Well, that's what a kukri is for.
Is it really designed for beheading? Okay.
Well, most point heavy weapons are designed less for fighting and more for like lopping limbs and lopping off heads. It's point heavy, so it's not really well balanced for fighting against another weapon.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then, how about let's do one last one. The monster that most of my guests and a lot of listeners are more afraid of than any, the werewolf. So maybe let's imagine a small bear-sized, rage-filled, half wolf, half man, and he's coming after you. You don't have, say, silver weapons. What would you advise we do?
Okay, this is I'm going to default to some of the things I talked about in a podcast I did recently, where I talked about if a human were to fight a chimp.
Ooh. Oh man, how did I miss that one? I gotta find that one.
It's a two-parter. It's fairly recent. It's entitled Interspecies Combat.
Okay.
And so anyway, I'll just sort of poach for myself here. Of course, a werewolf is a step up from a chimpanzee, but nevertheless, you're still talking about a strong, explosive, angry animal with teeth. The chimp doesn't have claws, but the werewolf does. If I were to have a ghost of a chance against a werewolf, I would have to get in grappling range with it. Unless I could, unless I could evade some of its initial charges. But I'd have to try to get on its back and try to choke it out. And I don't foresee good much probability of that. But if I had to try something, I suppose that's what I would try to do.
Yeah, maybe
I don't know how effective.
Toriando, get him past there or
Yeah.
a slide by. I don't know.
Yeah, if I could get him on the ground first. I mean, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, man. Okay, so I feel good about our chances against a zombie with the low line
Well, let
knee
me give
kick.
you a little more what I was talking about with the chimp. Let's say
Oh
I was
yeah,
not able.
yeah.
Let's say I was not able to get behind it, but somehow I got in close, face to face with it, and was not disemboweled by its claws. Then what I'm going to need to do is get in close with it and jam a forearm into its mouth, which sounds counterintuitive. But when bite damage is done much more by the tearing away after biting than by the actual bite itself.
Oh,
The bite sets up the damage. Like think about what a crocodile does or an alligator. They bite and then they spin on their long axis and they tear chunks of flesh loose. Or think about how a shark bites and just shakes its head from side to side. Same thing a dog does or a wolf. You've seen wolves eating. They'll bite a hold of some meat and they'll shake like their head just like they shake a sock or something when you're playing with them. That's an instinctive movement for them. They're tearing meat loose. So if you could hold the werewolf's head still by, say, jamming its head down into the ground with your forearm long enough, then you're okay until you can maybe get around behind it. If you can do enough damage to it while you're doing that, it may even turn its back to you for a second, giving you a chance to get to its back. But I'd rather get on its back. And that idea came from, trying to think about a chimp, because a chimp, first of all, it's a myth that they are 3 to 5 times stronger than humans. I did my research and they're 1.3 to 1.5%, 1.3 to 1.5 times stronger than a human, which is still bad, but much more manageable. But it's those damn jaws that are the problem. As it turns out, in the case of chimps, their jaws, while they do have big canines, they actually have less bite power than a human, which is counterintuitive because they spend all day chewing. But the human skull actually has better leverage. This is a recent study was able to determine this. And so while I'm not going to bite the chimp, I have felt human bites before. And so, that lets me know that, okay, if I can just stop this thing from tearing my flesh away, I've got a chance if I can take its jaws out of the fight. If you can take the chimp's jaws out of the fight, it's really nothing more than a very talented, untrained ground and pounder.
I wonder why we have such strong jaws then. That's crazy to me. And it's reminding me a little bit of the old story about the Spartans boycotting some of the original ancient Grecian or ancient Hellenistic Olympics because in pancration, their essentially their no holds barred fighting championship, mixed martial arts. They decided in Athens to ban eye gouging and biting, and then the Spartans said, "Well, then you're not fighting."
What a bunch of pussies!
Yeah, and so they were like, "Then we're not competing in anything if you're not even going to actually compete in combat." So biting was serious.
I had never heard that. That's fascinating. Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, the Athenians were. I mean, the Spartans already thought the Athenians were a bunch of sissies anyway.
Yeah.
Did you listen to my podcast about Sparta? I did a 4-part podcast starting off, and the title is "This is Sparta." And for the first couple of episodes, I talk about how misleading the movie 300 is. The way it depicts Sparta as, there's actually a term called laconophilia, and it's an ancient term, and it goes back to the people who thought that Sparta was an admirable society and that more societies should pattern themselves after it. And that's what laconophilia was. Like Plato was a laconophile.
I was like Plato. Yeah, and he was a hell of a wrestler himself, by the way.
Yes, but but the reality was it was a horrible society. It was built on the back of slaves. I mean, it was worse than the Southern plantation society in the United States antebellum South. Excuse me. And the stuff that they did the stuff that they did to their slaves makes what the white plantation owners in the South look benign. They actually had an entire subset of their military called the Krypteia, whose job was, they were essentially like the KKK and the Gestapo all rolled into one. They had undercover guys that would disguise themselves as slaves and go live in the slave communities. And then they would watch for anyone who showed anything that looked like leadership skills or intelligence and drop a note to their superiors, and that guy would immediately be singled out, and he and his family would be lavishly killed in front of everyone.
Oh man, that's
Stalin.
I mean, Stalin.
It was
kind of
very
stuff right
Stalin-esque, and Stalin admired Sparta and actually started a whole series of games that were called the Spartakiad or something like that games, like to be parallel to the Olympic Games. So the Soviets definitely admired Sparta, but it just cracks me up how many people depict Sparta as this admirable society. So anyway, I talk about that in a 4-part podcast, and in the last part, I talk about the Abraham Lincoln of Greece, a guy named Epaminondas, who freed the Helot slaves in Sparta by beating the Spartans. He was the first guy to really kick their ass in battle, and I talk about how he figured out how to do it. It's a neat story.
Yeah, and you do a great job in your podcast of mixing kind of historical, military with like individual martial arts. I'm thinking of one. We've got them where we've got the enemy where we want them. They're all around us, kind of thing.
Yes.
about the controlling the center line or the advantages of being surrounded externally, both militarily and martial arts style.
Right. That's in military terminology. That's called the advantage of interior lines. Now, you'd still rather not have the advantage of interior lines. You'd rather, be someone else. But if you are surrounded, you at least have certain small advantages. And one of them is communication. And like jiu-jitsu is a fantastic example. Like one of the basic principles of the guard is whoever controls the interior space controls the situation, no matter whether they're on the bottom or on the top. And the guard is the epitome of that, especially when you're talking the half guard and the butterfly guard and the ashigarami leg entanglements. All of those is whoever controls that interior space. And it's fascinating to me how that gets recreated in military history in other respects. So yeah, that's what that one was about.
Yeah. And so, and again, we're going to have, I've got links, to Martial Brain podcast and YouTube, instructionals in the description. But when we end up here soon, I'm going to have you give us some more details on where to find you. Man, I've already had you here for about an hour. Dang. Okay. Well, I'll try to, let me try to start reeling this in with a little bit of, you've kind of produced a nice bridge here to the kind of rationalistic, skeptical, logical minded principles that you've used to guide your thinking and decisions and training ever since I knew you, and I think for quite some time. And on this show so far, we've explored the extreme opposites of not only kind of the folklore and the mythology and the world of fiction, but even into the mystical and the occult, with even, let's say, one of the most popular episodes on this podcast has been a conversation with John Michael Greer, leading occult expert, openly, practicing occult magician and druid. And I haven't really had anybody talk about the other end of that spectrum, the skeptical minded. So what might be the skeptic's take on, and what might be Jeff Westfall's take on finding out that his super freak is spending time with magicians and the occult, and maybe you can give us a skepticism PSA on what to make of a culture and a mythology and a culture and a society that has so many deeply important and rooted monster tales, and so many people to this very day, focused on the magic and the occult as real forces in the universe.
It really kind of it goes right to the name of my podcast. The second half of the name is the third word is brain. The human brain is this really amazing, crazy, weird, quirky thing. It's evolution does not eliminate the old and replace it with something new. You can't, evolution can't take a chimpanzee or excuse me, let's say a Homo erectus brain and destroy it and design a better one. You have to add to that Homo erectus brain with new material, but the old material is still going to be there. So the human brain, if I were to compare it to a car, it would be if we had a chariot, and instead of just eliminating the chariot, we sort of put, we jury rigged rubber tires around the old wooden or the old steel tire or iron tires, and we jury rigged an engine compartment and had to reinforce it. We had to leave that original chariot there, even if we built up to a modern car. That's the way our brains evolved. We still have a reptile brain in there, and a mammalian brain, and a brain not unlike a chimpanzee's brain in there. And we have an unfortunate tendency to default away from the more human part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, at the drop of a hat. If you ever find yourself driving down the road and someone does something that angers you, and all of a sudden you find yourself pissed off, that's what I call the chimp getting his hands on the controls. And so we've got this amazing brain that has given us, Brahms and Schubert and, movie makers like Francis Ford Coppola and martial arts people like John Danaher and Bruce Lee and the Gracies. These amazing brains, and yet at the same time, it also gave us, sociopaths and psychopaths and Hitler and Stalin and Mao. So I'm fascinated by the capabilities of the human brain. I'm fascinated by the limitations of it and how to be, like, for example, we have a superpower that we almost never use. And it's called metacognition, which is the ability to think about what you're thinking and why you're thinking it. And, very few of us ever examine a thought that we just had and go, why the hell did I just think that? The default setting, I think, for most humans is it's got to be right. I'm thinking it. So because of that, I think that we have a tendency.
I think both simultaneously, for what it's worth. I think I must be right. Plus, there's no way I'm right because I can't trust my insane self.
That's what I was referring to earlier. That's neuropsychological humility is a term that was coined, I think, by Stephen Novella of The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And that is the humility that comes with knowing that despite learning the principles of scientific skepticism, understanding the limitations of your own brain is not enough. You have to be on your guard all the time, because just because you know that your brain has certain cognitive biases and a proneness to logical fallacies, that doesn't alter the fact that you'll jump into them just as quick as anyone else does. And I think we're powerfully curious animals. We love stories. Me telling you a story about a woman being killed in a car crash is far more gripping than me giving you a statistic about 50,000 people being killed in a car crash. So data means much less to a human than a story does. So we have this driving need, I think, for a storyteller. I don't need to explain to you. You're a writer. The narrative is a huge part of the human psyche. And so if we have something that we don't understand about the natural world, if we don't know the story about it, well, damn it, we'll make up a story about it. And every culture has done that. And I think it's perfectly understandable that we would have a propensity for developing magical theories for how the world works. Like, let's take, for example, chi power, which is this, in my opinion, probably almost surely non-existent life force that's supposed to inhabit the body in Chinese traditional medicine. It's supposed to be energy, but it doesn't exist anywhere on the electromagnetic spectrum. We can't detect it with any instruments. You can't come up with robust, replicatable studies indicating that anything using qi works. Acupuncture doesn't work beyond the level of a placebo. But yet at the same time, this was the major foundation for a whole system of medicine for thousands of years. And when you come down to it, qi in Chinese translates as breath. So it's easy to see that way back when they say, oh, he stopped breathing. He no longer has his vital life force. They didn't know what oxygen was, so they told a story and built an entire thing around it. And that's how ancient wisdom, I think, gets started. And when we refer to ancient wisdom, we always do it in very hushed, reverent tones. When in reality, it's nearly always just a big collection of suppositions and magical thinking. And it's perfectly understandable how we would develop all of these folklores and how people would speak about it in whispered tones. I don't know. It seems to me like people say, well, how do we come up with all these stories? And my question would be, well, how could we not come up with all these stories? Knowing the human animal and its propensity for always wanting to answer questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and I think maybe in there lies kind of an answer to the monster in the room that we haven't addressed, or the elephant in the room, that your own martial arts academy. It's not the Jeff Westfall Martial Arts Academy; it's the Rising Phoenix Martial Arts Academy. And so why, and we've talked to the Phoenix, we talked about the Phoenix as a monster, as a mythical creature. So why would a rationally minded fella pick the Phoenix as his school's emblem? And I think you've kind of begun laying out that answer right there, but maybe we'll get focused more specifically on that.
Well, in my case, it was simply symbolic. In the 70s, when I was beginning to teach, and I started thinking about opening an academy, and I started thinking hard about what to name it. In Evansville, there were probably 4 different places called the something dragon. There was the ultimate dragon. There was the white dragon temple. There was the golden dragon. And I was like, damn it, it's not going to be a dragon. But I still was interested in maybe, coming up with some sort of logo or symbol. And if I were to do it over again, I probably would go more towards rationality. I might pick still a fire-like thing. I might pick a flame as a symbol, meaning the light in the darkness, like Carl Sagan's book was called the Demon Haunted World. And on the picture, on the cover, there's a picture of a candle. Lighting the darkness through the ignorance of the natural human condition. But anyway, I can't tell you how many times as an athlete and as a martial artist, I've gone through cycles of periods where I felt like I was in a slump, things weren't going well, psychologically, physically, and if I just stuck with it, eventually some catalyst would push me past that point, and I would sort of experience a feeling almost of rebirth, in a sort of mini way. And the longer I've been in the martial arts, I've experienced this again and again. It's like, it's naturally, anybody who's done any weight training knows that your growth is not linear. It's cyclic. You get stronger, you have a setback, you have to start training again, and eventually you get a little stronger than you were before. But it's like stair steps, or like a graph that's got ups and downs. And it struck me that this was like a cycle of death and rebirth. And that's what the phoenix symbolizes. And it's also struck me that by using it as a symbol, I was able to try to explain to students that it's not only understandable that you have these ups and downs, it's something you should embrace. So I guess that's why I chose it as a symbol at the time.
And I think it's cool. I think it's cool that we can use a monster to talk about very realistic and rational things ever so quickly. And
sure.
I think that kind of matches up with what you're saying. Like we've essentially got a very jerry-rigged chariot that we're working with our brain, and speaking of monsters or mythical beings, helps us operate this thing quite a bit. So.
I think a lot stems from our childhood as well. When you're growing up, mom and dad are the closest things to real deities that you're ever going to run into. I mean, mom is like this earth mother that, she can kiss things and make it better, for crying out loud. She's always there to clean it up after you. She's making stuff for you, unless you have a terrible mom, which is possible. Your dad is like this great hero. He scares monsters off, right? Scares them out of your closet, scares them out from under your bed. He'll fight him and kill him if he has to. He operates all this amazing machinery without fear. So your mom and dad are like deities, and you live in this little bubble. And then when you become an adolescent and all of a sudden your parents are subjugated to the realm of the irrelevant, you've got this hole left in your psyche for, sort of mystical beings, I think. There's also all the unknowns. Your brain, when you're a little kid, makes monsters. It populates monsters all throughout your psyche. It's a human thing to do. We're the only species that can contemplate our own, so far as we know, can contemplate our own mortality. What a thing to saddle a species with, walking around constantly knowing that you're mortal. So it's completely understandable that we would manufacture monsters and be obsessed with them.
Yeah, well, good, because I am, and I can't stop. I still manufacture them, no matter how many years I'm supposed to be removed from childhood. But anyway, you've been extremely generous with your time. I am well past an hour, and man, I was trying to keep it to 40 minutes if I could, and I'm way past that. So
Feel
maybe
free to
we
edit
can.
me down.
Oh, no, I like all of this. I think I want to keep it all. And I normally don't. I don't think I edit people down anyway. Well, how about this? For people wanting to know more about Jeff Westfall and the Rising Phoenix,
you don't.
the Martial Brain. Oh, yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. I mean, if they got this far, they're interested. And I've got to go back and catch up on Sparta and the Chimp episodes. I'm not sure how I missed those, but man, I'm pumped about listening to those. So where should they go to find out more about the Martial Brain, or your YouTube instructionals, or about the Rising Phoenix Martial Arts Academy if they're anywhere or near Evansville, Indiana?
Okay, I'll take those from most recent to least recent. The YouTube channel is simply my name, Jeff Westfall. Now, there are several other channels with that name, so I probably should change it in the future. But anyway, if you just go to YouTube and you type Jeff Westfall into the search engine and maybe put martial arts on after that, you'll probably get right to it. I've made about 50, 55 videos. I'm just trying to create content for my students during this COVID crisis. And I've just thrown it up free for everyone. As a result, the quality is not what it would be if I really took my time and made something that I was going to sell. But anyway, so that's easy to find. My podcast is called The Martial Brain. It's available at my website, which is RP, that's for Rising Phoenix, rpmartialarts.com. All 216 episodes that I've put out so far are there on the website to be listened to. You also can find the 50 most recent ones at Stitcher and iTunes and a number of other aggregators that I'm not familiar with. If you just go online and Google The Martial Brain, it'll be maybe one of the first few hits that you get. As I already mentioned, my academy's website is rpmartialarts.com.
Fantastic. So I've got links to all those in the description here, but if you're just driving and listening and you've got that, then we've got perhaps enough info in your brain to make sure you don't forget by the time you get back to a computer. And I think we even left you with not only some good cognitive tools to work with, some perhaps martial arts knowledge to use in real life, but if you find yourself confronted with zombies, with werewolves, or with vampires, we are at least a little more likely to survive the encounter now after this episode than we were before. Again, Jeff, it's been a huge pleasure and a great honor to speak with you again, and it's been great to catch up with you after all these years as well.
You too, Josh.